At 9:17 a.m. on January 22, 1943, Second Lieutenant John George crouched inside the shattered remains of a Japanese bunker west of Point Cruz. Through a rifle scope his fellow officers had mocked for 6 weeks, he watched a banyan tree 240 yards away. He was 27 years old, an Illinois state shooting champion. 0 confirmed kills. 11 Japanese snipers were operating in the Point Cruz groves. In the previous 72 hours, they had killed 14 men from the 132nd Infantry Regiment. George's commanding officer had called his rifle a toy. Other platoon leaders joked that it was his mail-order sweetheart. When George first unpacked his Winchester Model 70, fitted with a Lyman Alaskan scope and Griffin and Howe mount at Camp Forest, Tennessee, the armorer asked if it was meant for deer or Germans. George replied that it was for the Japanese. They shipped out before the rifle arrived. During the voyage to Guadalcanal, George watched other soldiers clean their Garands while his own weapon sat in a warehouse back in Illinois. He requested it be forwarded through military mail. 6 weeks later, in late December 1942, a supply sergeant handed him a wooden crate stamped "Fragile." Inside was the rifle George had spent 2 years of National Guard pay to buy. The rifle weighed 9 pounds. The scope added another 12 ounces. The Garand issued to every other man in the battalion weighed 9.5 pounds, with no magnification. George's rifle was bolt action, 5 rounds. The Garand was semi-automatic, 8 rounds. Captain Morris ordered him to leave the sporting rifle in his tent and carry a real weapon. George carried it anyway. The 132nd Infantry relieved the Marines on Guadalcanal in late December 1942. The Marines had been fighting since August. They had captured Henderson Field and held it, but Mount Austin still stood, and the Japanese remained entrenched in the coastal groves west of the Matanikau River. Mount Austin rose 1,514 feet. The Japanese called it the Gifu. 500 defenders, 47 bunkers. George's battalion attacked on December 17th and fought for 16 days. 34 men were killed. 279 were wounded. By the time the western slope fell on January 2nd, George had fired his Winchester exactly 0 times in combat. Point Cruz was different. No bunkers, no fixed lines, only Japanese soldiers who had withdrawn west from Henderson Field and disappeared into massive trees. Some of them were snipers, armed with scoped Arisaka Type 99 rifles. They knew the jungle. They knew how to wait. On January 19th, a sniper killed Corporal Davis while he filled canteens at a creek. On January 20th, another sniper killed 2 men from L Company on patrol. On January 21st, 3 more died. 1 shot through the neck from a tree the patrol had passed twice. That night, the battalion commander summoned George. The snipers were killing his men faster than malaria. He needed someone who could shoot. He wanted to know if that mail-order rifle could do the job. George listed his credentials: Illinois state champion at 1,000 yards in 1939, 23 years old at the time, the youngest winner in state history, 6-inch groups at 600 yards with iron sights, 5 rounds inside 4 inches at 300 yards with the Lyman Alaskan. The commander gave him until morning to prove it. George spent the night preparing his rifle. It had been packed in cosmolin for the ocean crossing. He cleaned it again, checked the mounts, loaded 5 rounds of .30-06, military ball, the same cartridge used by the Garand. At dawn on January 22nd, George moved into the ruins of a bunker captured 3 days earlier. It overlooked the coconut groves west of Point Cruz. Intelligence reported that Japanese snipers were using the banyan trees, some 90 feet tall, with trunks 8 feet thick. A man could climb one before dawn and remain unseen all day. George brought no spotter, no radio, only his rifle, a canteen, and 60 rounds of ammunition in stripper clips. The Lyman Alaskan offered just 2.5 power magnification. Not much, but enough. The jungle was never silent. Birds, insects, distant artillery. George filtered it all out and focused on movement. At 9:17, he saw it. A branch shifted. No wind. 87 feet up, in a banyan tree 240 yards away. He watched. The movement returned, then the shape, dark clothing, wedged in the fork of 3 branches. The Japanese sniper faced east, watching the supply trail. George adjusted 2 clicks for wind, controlled his breathing. The trigger broke clean and smooth. The rifle cracked. The sniper jerked, fell, and tumbled 90 feet to the jungle floor. George worked the bolt and stayed on the scope. Japanese snipers worked in pairs. At 9:43, he found the second, 60 yards north, lower in the tree, moving down the trunk. George led the motion and fired. The second sniper fell backward, his rifle clattering through the branches. 2 shots. At 9:43, he caught the second sniper, a different tree, about 60 yards north of the first, lower too, maybe 50 feet up. The Japanese soldier was sliding down the trunk, retreating. He'd heard the shot and knew the position was burned. George tracked the movement, led him by inches, and fired. The sniper pitched backward, vanished through the branches, his rifle clattering down after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. George fed another clip into the Winchester. His hands stayed calm. His breathing stayed slow. This felt like Camp Perry, except the targets could shoot back. At 11:21, a round slammed into the sandbag wall 6 inches from his head, bursting grit across his face. George snapped left, pressed into the bunker's shadow, and went still. The shot came from the southwest, new angle, new shooter. He waited a full 3 minutes before easing back. Then he started glassing the trees to the southwest, one by one. The shooter should have relocated after firing, that was doctrine. But in jungle, this dense relocation options were limited. At 11:38, George found him, 3rd tree from the left in a cluster of 5, roughly 73 feet up. The sniper had shifted branches, but stayed in the same tree. Mistake. George settled the crosshairs and fired. The figure dropped without a sound. By noon, George had 5 snipers down. Word spread fast. Men who'd mocked his mail-order rifle now asked to watch. George refused. Spectators drew attention, attention drew fire. After the 5th kill, the Japanese adapted. They stopped moving in daylight. George spent the afternoon staring into branches and shadows and seeing nothing. At 1600, he returned to Battalion HQ. Captain Morris was waiting. No jokes left in his voice. He wanted George back in position at first light. January 23rd began with rain. Heavy tropical rain that turned the ground to soup and erased the tree line beyond 100 yards. George stayed in the bunker and listened to it pound the canopy. The rain finally eased at 8:15. By 8:45, visibility was back, enough to work. At 9:12, George spotted the first sniper of the day. The Japanese soldier had climbed into position during the rain. Smart. The noise masked the movement. He'd also chosen a tree 290 yards out, longer than yesterday. Smarter. They were learning. George held for distance and sent the round. The sniper fell. Kill number 6 brought an answer George didn't expect. At 9:57, Japanese mortars started walking rounds toward its bunker. They'd triangulated him, muzzle flash, sound, maybe both. First rounds landed 40 yards short. Second salvo, 20. The third would hit. George grabbed his rifle and ran. He sprinted north along the tree line and threw himself into a shell crater. A heartbeat later, the third salvo landed. The bunker vanished in dust, fire, and flying timber. He crawled out, relocated again, this time behind a fallen tree about 120 yards north. It gave him cover and a clean view into the groves. George settled in, and now the hunt changed. The Japanese weren't just hiding anymore, they were hunting him back. This wasn't target shooting. It was a duel. At 14:23, George dropped his 7th sniper. At 15:41, he got his 8th, 94 feet up a banyan tree. Great concealment until the sun shifted and the height betrayed him, cutting a faint silhouette against the sky. At 1700, Captain Morris sent a runner. George had been in position 9 hours. Morris wanted numbers. George gave them 8 confirmed kills in 2 days, 12 rounds fired, 8 hits, 4 misses. Morris ordered him back out at dawn on January 24th. That night, George cleaned the Winchester and did the math. 11 Japanese snipers in the Point Cruz groves, 8 dead, 3 left, and the 3 left were the best, the ones who'd survived long enough to learn. Now they knew what George looked like, and they knew exactly what rifle he carried. George loaded 5 fresh rounds and tried to sleep. At 3 a.m., he gave up, sat in his tent with the rifle across his lap. Rain returned at 4:15. By 5:30, it was heavy enough to delay first light operations. George used the cover to move, not the bunker, not the fallen tree, somewhere they wouldn't expect. He chose a cluster of large rocks about 70 yards south, an old Marine machine gun nest from December. Solid cover, overlapping fields of fire into the groves. He settled in and waited. At 7:43, the rain softened to drizzle. Visibility opened. George began glassing. At 8:17 on January 24th, he found sniper number 9, a palm tree 190 yards out, low, only about 40 feet up. Unusual. Most snipers climbed high for sight lines. This one chose concealment over elevation. Palm fronds wrapped him like a blind. But George wasn't at ground level. From the rocks, he had a downward angle, just enough to see a dark shape. Shoulders, head, the line of a rifle. He aimed, controlled his breathing, started the trigger press, then stopped. Something felt wrong. The position was too obvious, too easy. George had been hunting snipers for 3 days. 8 men were already dead. The remaining 3 wouldn't make beginner mistakes. They wouldn't place themselves where an elevated shooter could spot them unless it was bait. George eased off the trigger and lowered the rifle. If the palm sniper was a decoy, the real shooter would be positioned to cover him, watching for the shot, waiting for muzzle flash, ready to answer it. George began to search, slow, methodical, left to right, top to bottom, every tree within 300 yards of the palm. It took 11 minutes. At 8:28, he found the real threat. A banyan tree roughly 80 yards northwest of the palm, 91 feet up, a near-perfect hide. Branches and hanging vines masked him from 3 sides. From that position, the sniper had a clean line of sight to George's previous location at the fallen tree. He wasn't watching George. He was watching where George had been. George now had 2 problems. First, If he fired at the hidden sniper, the report would expose his true position. The man could relocate before George worked the bolt and chambered a second round. Second, if George did nothing, the sniper would eventually realize George wasn't at the fallen tree and start searching. George chose a third option. He decided to use the bait. He swung back to the palm tree, adjusted for wind, and fired. The decoy jerked and dropped through the fronds. George immediately snapped the rifle back to the banyan. The real sniper reacted as expected. He turned toward the sound. That turn created movement. George caught it. A slight shift in shadow. He fired before the man could finish repositioning. The sniper fell. His rifle tumbled after him. 2 shots, 2 kills. But George had burned his position. He grabbed rifle and ammunition and ran east along the rock line, then dove into a drainage ditch roughly 40 yards away. He pressed into the mud and went still. At 8:34, Japanese machine gun fire tore into the rocks he had occupied 6 seconds earlier. Bullets shattered stone and kicked up clouds of dust. The burst lasted 17 seconds. When it stopped, George counted to 60. Then he moved. He relocated again, this time to a shell crater about 100 yards east, half filled with rainwater. He slid in until the water reached his chest, rested the Winchester on the rim, and resumed glassing. 10 confirmed kills, 1 remaining. The last sniper would be the best, the smartest, the most experienced. He had watched 10 comrades die in 3 days. He knew George's methods. He knew the rifle. He knew the general area. And somewhere out there, he was watching. George scanned through the Lyman Alaskan. The magnification made distant shapes visible, but not identifiable. Every dark patch could be a branch or a man. Each one demanded time. At 9:47, George realized his mistake. The last sniper wasn't in the trees. He was on the ground. George caught movement at the edge of his vision, low, deliberate, about 60 yards south. A shape sliding through undergrowth parallel to the tree line, using ferns, vines, and fallen branches for cover. The sniper was crawling toward George's last known position at the rocks. George stayed motionless in the water-filled crater. The Winchester was already shouldered, breathing steady. But the angle was wrong. The rim of the crater blocked his line of sight. To take the shot, George would have to rise, and rising would expose him. At 9:52, the Japanese sniper stopped. He'd reached a point roughly 40 yards from the rocks. George watched as the man studied the position, scanning for movement. George waited. Patience was the foundation of sniper work, not speed, not aggression. The ability to let time pass and force the other man to move first. At 9:58, the sniper began crawling again. 35 yards, 30, 25. He was approaching from the south, the same direction George had taken when he'd fled the machine gun fire. The man had been paying attention. At 10:03, the sniper reached the rocks and slipped into the old machine gun nest, facing east toward the drainage ditch, toward where George should have been. He was now only 38 yards from George's actual position, and his back was exposed. George had a clear shot, center mass, an easy kill, even without magnification. But George hesitated. This man had survived 10 days in the Point Cruz groves. He had outlived 10 other snipers, men who died because they made mistakes. This man would not make one. The position was too exposed, too vulnerable. No experienced sniper would stay there unless it served a purpose. George widened his search. If this was bait, the real danger would be somewhere with a line of sight to anyone who took the shot. At 10:06, George found it. A second Japanese soldier lay 70 yards northwest of the rocks, tucked behind a fallen tree trunk. He wasn't moving, not adjusting, just watching. His rifle was trained on the drainage ditch, where George should have been. 2 men, not 1. Either the 11th sniper had brought support, or these were the final 2, numbers 10 and 11, working together. George made his decision. He couldn't kill both before they reacted. The Winchester was bolt action. Working the bolt would give them time to find him, time to return fire. He needed another approach. George eased himself deeper into the water, slowly, inch by inch, until only his eyes and the crown of his head remained above the surface. He held the Winchester upright, barrel pointed skyward to keep it dry, and he waited. At 10:13, the Japanese soldier in the rocks stood up. He'd watched the drainage ditch for 10 minutes and seen nothing. He believed George had moved farther east. The man turned and signaled to his partner behind the fallen tree. Both soldiers began moving east in parallel, about 70 yards apart. A sweep. They were trying to flush George out. George stayed motionless. The 2 men passed his crater. They were now between George and the tree line. Their backs were exposed. George rose from the water slowly, silently. He brought the Winchester to his shoulder. Water ran from the barrel, his sleeves, his face. He aimed at the closer man, the one who'd been in the rocks, now 42 yards away. George fired. The soldier dropped. George worked the bolt, chambered another round, swung to the second man by the fallen tree. The Japanese soldier was turning, bringing his rifle up. George fired first. The second soldier fell. 11 shots fired over 3 days. 11 Japanese snipers dead. George had cleared the Point Cruz groves of the threat that had killed 14 Americans in 72 hours. As he climbed from the crater and gathered his spent brass, he heard something that froze him in place. Voices, Japanese voices, from the tree line, more than one. George dropped back into the crater. The water was cold and muddy. He submerged again, leaving only his eyes above the surface, holding the Winchester vertical. The voices grew louder, at least 6 men, maybe more, moving toward the fallen bodies. Branches snapped, equipment rattled. These weren't snipers. Infantry, a patrol, or a recovery team. The voices stopped at the first body, 42 yards from George's crater. Close enough that he could hear the words even if he couldn't understand them. Then they moved to the second body. Faster speech now, tighter, urgent. At 10:28, the voices shifted again, not back toward the tree line, toward George. They had found his tracks, boot prints in the mud leading from the rocks to the crater. George had been careful about noise, careful about movement. He hadn't been careful about footprints. 5 rounds left in the Winchester, at least 6 Japanese soldiers. Bad odds. The voices closed in. 30 yards, 25, 20. At 10:31, a Japanese soldier appeared at the crater's rim. He looked down. Their eyes met. George fired from the water. The soldier fell backward. George worked the bolt while still submerged, chambered another round, then rose. 2 more soldiers stood at the rim. George fired, worked the bolt, fired again. Both men dropped. 3 rounds left. Shouting now, more movement, more boots. George climbed out on the north side of the crater away from the voices and ran. 20 yards. Then he dropped behind a fallen tree. Japanese rifle fire cracked through the jungle. Bullets snapped past, struck dirt, chewed bark. They were firing at sound, at motion. George stayed low. Through the scope, he caught movement. 2 soldiers advancing toward the crater, 50 yards out. George aimed at the lead man and fired. The soldier fell. The second dove for cover. 2 rounds left. More voices. Behind him now. They were flanking him. One group from the south, another from the east. George was about to be surrounded. He made his decision. He couldn't win a firefight, bolt-action rifle against multiple semi-automatics. He needed to break contact. George grabbed the Winchester and ran north. Vines snagged his boots. Branches lashed his face. Rifle fire chased him, rounds snapping past, slamming into trees, throwing dirt into the air. He ran for 90 seconds before diving into another shell crater. This one was dry. George pressed himself against the wall and listened. The voices were distant now. They weren't pursuing. They were regrouping around their dead. George checked his rifle. On February 7th, George was operating near the Tanambogo River when a Japanese rifleman shot him. The bullet struck his left shoulder. The impact spun him around and dropped him to the ground. Corporal Hayes dragged George to cover and called for a corpsman. The wound was serious, but not fatal. The round passed cleanly through muscle, missing bone and major blood vessels. George was evacuated to a field hospital near Henderson Field. Doctors cleaned the wound and sutured it closed. He would recover, they told him, but no combat operations for at least 3 weeks. George spent 2 weeks in the field hospital. During that time, the Japanese completed their evacuation of Guadalcanal. On February 9th, American forces reached Cape Esperance and found it empty. The campaign was over. George's sniper section had operated for 12 days. 74 confirmed kills. 0 friendly casualties during sniper operations. The section was formally recognized by division headquarters. Colonel Ferry submitted a recommendation for George to receive the Bronze Star. But George's war was not finished. While he recovered, new orders arrived from Pacific Command. The Army needed experienced combat officers for a new mission, somewhere in Burma. The details were classified. George volunteered. By March, he was aboard a transport ship heading west across the Pacific. His Winchester Model 70 was packed in a waterproof case in the cargo hold. The Lyman Alaskan scope was wrapped in oilcloth. George didn't know the specifics of the mission, only that it involved jungle warfare, long-range patrols, and operations behind Japanese lines, the kind of fighting where a man who could hit targets at 600 yards might be useful. The ship reached India on April 3rd. George and 200 other officers were briefed. They would join a new unit, roughly 3,000 men. It had no official name yet. The men called themselves Merrill's Marauders. The unit would later be designated the 5307 Composite Unit, provisional. But training had already begun. Long-range penetration tactics, jungle survival, extended operations without supply lines. The concept was modeled after the British Chindits, small mobile forces operating deep behind enemy lines. George was assigned to the 2nd Battalion. Officially, he was listed as a rifle platoon leader. The U.S. Army had no formal sniper designation, but Colonel Ferry's recommendation followed him from Guadalcanal. Battalion command knew exactly what George could do with a rifle. Training took place in central India. The terrain differed from Guadalcanal, but the principles were the same: heat, humidity, dense vegetation, limited visibility. Burma would be worse: steeper ground, heavier rain, an enemy who knew the terrain intimately. George modified his equipment. The Winchester had performed well on Guadalcanal, but Burma would mean weeks-long patrols with no resupply. Every ounce mattered. He replaced the Lyman Alaskan with a lighter Weaver 330 scope, same 2.5 times magnification, 8 ounces less weight. He also swapped the wooden stock for a lighter version. The rifle's weight dropped from 9 pounds 12 ounces to just under 9 pounds. It wasn't much, but over weeks of movement carrying 60 pounds of gear, it mattered. The Marauders entered Burma in February 1944. Their mission: advance through northern Burma and capture the Myitkyina airfield, a critical link for Allied supply routes into China. The Japanese defended the area with roughly 4,000 troops. The Marauders would approach overland through a terrain considered impassable: mountains, rivers, dense jungle, no roads, no artillery, no vehicles, just rifles, mortars, and movement. George's battalion stepped off on February 24th. The first week covered 83 miles through mountainous jungle. Men collapsed from exhaustion. Malaria spread quickly. Pack mules slipped on steep slopes. Several had to be shot after breaking legs. By March, the battalion had covered 217 miles and fought 12 engagements. Brief ambushes, sharp firefights, immediate withdrawals. The Marauders were never meant to hold ground. They were meant to disrupt, harass, and vanish. George used his Winchester only 3 times during the march. Once at 412 yards against a Japanese officer directing troops at a river crossing. Once at 380 yards against a machine gun position. Once at 290 yards against a sniper, pinning down a patrol, 3 shots, 3 kills. George never fired twice in the same engagement. The Winchester's report was distinct, different from the Garand's crack. 1 shot announced his presence. A second gave the enemy time to find him, shoot, move, disappear. The march to Myitkyina took 3 months. By late May, the Marauders had covered over 700 miles. Disease took more men than combat: malaria, dysentery, typhus. Of the 5,300 men who entered Burma, fewer than 3,000 remained effective. On May 17th, the Marauders captured Myitkyina airfield. The operation was a success, but the cost was severe. The unit was combat ineffective. Too many casualties, too many sick, too much time in the jungle without rest or proper medical care. George survived the Burma campaign. His Winchester survived as well. But the rifle that had proven so decisive on Guadalcanal was used only 7 times during 3 months of operations. The Marauders rarely fought at long range. Most combat was close, ambushes at 50 yards or less, violent firefights in vegetation so dense you could barely see 30 feet. During those months, George came to a realization. The Winchester Model 70 was an exceptional rifle, perhaps the finest bolt-action sporting rifle ever made. But warfare was changing. Semi-automatic rifles like the Garand were becoming standard. The next war would demand different weapons and different tactics. For George, there would be no next war, not immediately. By June 1944, he was evacuated from Burma with the rest of the Marauders. The unit was disbanded. George was reassigned to training duties in the United States. He never fired his Winchester in combat again. He returned home in July 1944, was promoted to captain, and assigned to Fort Benning, Georgia. There, he trained infantry officers in marksmanship and small unit tactics. He taught the lessons he had learned on Guadalcanal and in Burma: how to move through jungle terrain, how to identify and engage targets at distance, how to operate independently without supply lines. He kept his Winchester Model 70. The rifle had traveled from Illinois to Tennessee to Guadalcanal to India to Burma and finally to Georgia. It had killed at least 14 enemy soldiers in confirmed engagements, likely more. George stopped counting after Burma. The rifle sat in a footlocker in his quarters at Fort Benning. He rarely looked at it. The war had moved on. The Pacific Islands were being retaken one by one. American forces were advancing through France and into Germany. Warfare was becoming industrial. Standardized weapons, interchangeable parts, identical training. George understood the necessity, but something was being lost. The individual skill, the craftsman's approach to soldiering, the idea that a single man properly trained and properly equipped could change the course of a fight. George was discharged from the Army in January 1947. Lieutenant Colonel, 2 Bronze Stars, 1 Purple Heart, Combat Infantryman Badge. He returned to Illinois and enrolled at Princeton University on the GI Bill. He studied politics and graduated with highest honors in 1950. He then spent 4 years at Oxford, followed by 4 years in British East Africa, studying regional politics and institutions. George eventually settled in Washington, D.C., serving as executive director of the Institute of African American Relations. Later, he joined the State Department's Foreign Affairs Institute as a consultant and lecturer on African affairs. He rarely spoke publicly about Guadalcanal or Burma. Colleagues knew he had served in the Pacific, but not about Point Cruz, not about the Japanese snipers, not about the Winchester Model 70 stored quietly in his home. In 1947, George decided to write everything down, not for publication, just to preserve the details while they were still clear. Weapons, tactics, jungle warfare. He wrote for 6 months. The manuscript grew to more than 400 pages. A friend at the National Rifle Association read it and urged him to publish. George hesitated. The book was technical. Rifles, ammunition, ballistics, not a popular war memoir. But he agreed. The book was published in 1947 under the title Shots Fired in Anger. It became a classic. No hero worship, no embellishment, just careful observation. What worked, what failed, and why. Today, it remains in print and is still studied by collectors, historians, and soldiers. George's descriptions of Japanese weapons are among the most detailed contemporary accounts from World War II. George lived to see 3 more wars: Korea, Vietnam, and the Gulf War. He watched military rifles evolve from the Garand to the M14 to the M16. He watched sniping become a formal specialty with doctrine, training, and dedicated equipment. Lessons once learned the hard way were finally institutionalized. John George died on January 3, 2009. He was 90 years old. His Winchester Model 70, the rifle that killed Japanese snipers on Guadalcanal, was donated to the National Firearms Museum in Fairfax, Virginia. It sits in a display case with a small placard describing its history. Most visitors walk past without stopping. It looks like any other old hunting rifle, but it isn't. It's the rifle that proved a state champion marksman with a mail-order scope could outshoot professionally trained military snipers. The rifle that cleared the Point Cruz groves in 4 days when an entire battalion couldn't do it in 2 weeks. The rifle that helped change how the American military thought about individual marksmanship in modern warfare. If this story moved you, do us a favor, hit the like button. Every like helps this story reach more people. Subscribe and turn on notifications. We're rescuing forgotten histories from dusty archives every day. Real people, real skill, real courage. Leave a comment and tell us where you're watching from and if someone in your family served. You're not just watching history, you're helping keep it alive.